So now that we're done with all the boring anatomy, we can get to the interesting part and actually looking at how exercise affects the heart and makes the heart stronger and everything. So whenever you talk about the heart, you're always talking about three certain variables. You're always talking about heart rate. That's one that you're always looking at. Talking about the stroke volume and the cardiac output. These are the most important things, or the values that can be played with in the heart. Heart rate is just how fast the heart's beating. It's very simple. So it's how fast it's beating. And remember, one heart rate was that whole cycle of blood going through the heart and being pumped throughout the body. And that's one heart rate, or one heartbeat. And heart rate is always measured in beats per second, or I mean beats per minute. So how many beats a minute is the heart beating? Is that whole cycle of blood going through? Stroke volume, since the left ventricle pumps the blood throughout the body, and this is one we care about. The stroke volume is how much blood the left ventricle pumps. So of course, with a higher stroke volume, that means you pump out more blood with every single beat. So that means each beat is more efficient. And of course, you want a higher stroke volume because that means you're pumping out more blood, and blood is good. And cardiac output is just the total amount of blood a minute. Or volume, how it's normally said. So this is the total volume of blood that our heart is pumping per minute. Whereas stroke volume is total amounts the left ventricle is pumping every heartbeat. The cardiac output is the total volume of blood that the heart, or the left ventricle, since the left ventricle is pumping it, is pumping every single minute. So of course, with a higher cardiac output, that means you have more blood circulating your body every minute. And then just by doing math, it's easy. You can tell that cardiac output is equal to heart rate, how much times your heart is beating a minute, times stroke volume, how much blood your left ventricle is pumping with every single beat, and that equals cardiac output. So heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. This formula, you will fall in love with this formula by the time you take the test, because this is like the most important formula when it comes to the cardiovascular system. So these are just simple terms you have to understand whenever you're talking about how the heart is affected by exercise and how it gets stronger. So now we'll erase this. Now, what they really look at in exercise physiology, what exercise physiology is how training affects the heart, how it makes the heart stronger, and how it pumps out more blood. So that's what we'll look at. Now, we want to look at the training effects of exercise, the effects they have on the heart. So different things can happen depending on how much you exercise, and that's what we're looking at. So we always compare them via pre-trained state. So you're taking someone who's never, let's say, ran, since running is a big cardiovascular exercise activity. So we'll take someone's pre-trained who's never ran before in their life, and a trained athlete or an Olympic athlete, someone who clearly runs for a living. So the pre-trained athlete at rest, the heart is beating, of course, remember the SA node beats every 60 to 100 beats per minute by itself. So their heart rate is probably around 75 beats per minute. And that's normal. Because remember, the SA node beats 60 to 100 beats per minute, so their heart rate is probably around 70 to 75 beats per minute. So if anyone in this class, if you guys don't run, or if you don't exercise, which doesn't make sense because you're this major, you take your heart rate, and it's probably around 75 beats per minute at rest, if you're not excited or anything. Now you take a trained athlete at rest, and their heart rate will be much lower. Their heart rate can be, let's say, 45, so that's a fair number. So their heart rate at rest will probably be around 45 beats per minute. Now you might be wondering, how is this possible? Because the SA node beats automatically every 60 to 100 beats per minute. Well, it turns out the heart it's controlled by a certain part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll just put that, it's always abbreviated as PNS. And what the PNS does is this releases acetylcholine. So we'll just make this anonymous with acetylcholine. So whenever you see PNS, think acetylcholine. And acetylcholine, this is the rest and digest nervous system. So whenever your body is resting, its main purpose is to conserve energy. So whenever your body wants to conserve energy, because your body is very efficient, doesn't want to waste energy when it doesn't need to. And the lower your heart rate is, the less energy it's using to make it beat. So For a fit athlete, they have more parasympathetic activity, and this is a result of endurance training or cardiovascular training. So more cardiovascular training increases parasympathetic activity. They release more acetylcholine. With more acetylcholine, it lowers our heart rate below 60 to 100 beats per minute. So that's why it's possible to have a heart rate of 40 to 45 beats per minute and still be considered healthy, because the heart rate's lower because you have more parasympathetic activity because you exercise. So now we're looking at the stroke volumes. Pre-trained individual stroke volume is probably around 110. It's always measured in milliliters. 110 milliliters, that's probably how much blood your left ventricle is pumping out with every single of these 75 beats. And that's about normal. Now for a trained athlete, their stroke volume will be much higher. And we'll just say 140 to be fair. Don't know the exact number, but it'll be higher than a pre-trained athlete. Because when you're training, your heart gets stronger. Just like when you're training your bicep gets stronger. With a stronger muscle, it can pump out much more blood more forcibly with every single beat. Now the cardiac output will be about 5. It's always measured in liters per minute. So it'll be about 5 liters per minute. So every minute you have 5 liters of blood circling your body. Now the weird thing, or the thing that you have to understand, is for a pre-trained athlete, their cardiac output would also be 5 liters per minute. Now the reason for this is because at rest the body needs a certain amount of blood, and whether you're fit or unfit, your body still needs the same amount of blood. So this is why whether you're a pre-trained athlete or a trained athlete, you're the most out-of-shape person in the world, can't even walk upstairs, whatever, or you're extremely in shape, you still have the same cardiac output because your body still needs the same amount of blood at rest. So trained and pre-trained athletes both have a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. That is very important to note. That trained does not affect their cardiac output at rest. Now, when they're exercising, that's completely different, but at rest, it doesn't affect the cardiac output. So that's why you can look at these numbers. Since the heart rate decreased at rest, another easy way that I do it is always write the formula: cardiac output times stroke volume equals cardiac output. You write the formula, and since heart rate is decreasing, stroke volume is increasing, so cardiac output remains the same. Now for the trained athlete, it doesn't matter because heart rate is 75, whatever. Now this math I'm doing probably doesn't equal exactly 5 liters, but it's close enough. So that's at rest. Trained athlete has a much lower heart rate, higher stroke volume, but they have the same cardiac output. And now let's take a pre-trained athlete, someone who's not in shape, and see what happens when they start exercising. Well, what happens when you start exercising? We all know our heart rate will increase when we start exercising. Your heart rate will increase when you start exercising. Your stroke volume will also increase when you start exercising, which makes sense because when you exercise, your muscles need much more blood than they do at rest. So the body realizes this, and when you start exercising, the heart adapts and pumps out much more blood to supply these muscles. So thus your stroke volume will increase, the heart will pump out more blood to supply its muscles. But also heart rate increases because it's stress on the heart. We all know this, that your heart rate increases. And because of that formula, heart rate times stroke volume, cardiac output will increase. Now let's take a trained athlete. Now their heart rate will also increase. We all know this. No matter how in shape you are, if you start exercise, your heart rate's going to increase. Now the thing is that a pre-trained athlete, their heart rate will increase much faster than a trained athlete, and that's an easy test. Anyone can attest to it. If they never ran a day in their life and they start running, their heart rate will increase really fast, exponentially. Whereas if they're a fit athlete, they're in cross country and they run 5 miles a day, their heart rate will increase much slower because their body is used to the stress. So a trained athlete's heart rate will increase, but at the same intensity. How they always say it is, you take a pre-trained athlete and take, say, 50% of the VO2, and we'll explain VO2. But VO2 is just a measure of intensity. They take a pre-trained athlete and 50% of the VO2, their heart rate will increase exponentially. It'll increase extremely fast. Now take a trained athlete at 50% of the VO2, their heart rate will be much slower. So what this is showing is that a pre-trained athlete's heart rate raises much faster. So at the same intensity that a trained athlete is, their heart will be much higher. So everything is easier for a trained athlete, even though the heart rate still increases. Everything's harder for a pre-trained athlete. So their heart rate increases much more faster at the same intensity. Now their stroke volume will increase exponentially, much greater than a pre-trained athlete. This is the main training effect in a pre-trained athlete versus a trained athlete, is the stroke volume increases exponentially. Whereas for a pre-trained athlete, heart rate increases exponentially because the heart's not used to the exercise. It's a new stress. The muscle's not used to it. Just like when you exercise, your bicep's not used to a bicep curl, it's going to tire out extremely fast. Now take a trained athlete, their heart rate increases much slower because the muscle is used to it. Just like, again, you're a weightlifter, bicep curl, your muscle will tire out much slower because it's used to the stress. Now, since the heart rate increases much slower, the stroke volume increases exponentially. And stroke volume is the main thing that separates a trained athlete from a pre-trained athlete because they have a huge stroke volume. So the heart is much stronger because stroke volume, again, how much blood you pump out with every single beat. So really, it's kind of relates to how strong your muscle is. So since a trained athlete has a much stronger heart, it'll pump out much more blood with every single beat. Now, their cardiac output will be significantly greater. To play with some numbers, a cardiac output of a trained athlete or a world-class athlete is probably 30 liters per minute. So that means every single minute they're pumping 30 liters of blood. Now, that's a lot of fucking blood in their body every single minute. Now, a trained athlete will also have a higher cardiac output, but their cardiac output will only be 20 liters per minute. Again, much greater than at rest, but still not as great as this trained athlete. This is why trained athletes can exercise to a much greater intensity than untrained athletes, because they have a much higher stroke volume, cardiac output. And again, that's how much blood is circulating the body every single minute. So if you have 10 liters of blood circulating your body more than a pre-trained athlete, of course you're going to be able to exercise a lot longer because your muscles have the energy and have the blood. So that is the basics of what pre-training and how training affects the heart. Now we'll just go over a simple review and hit a few more quick things. Pre-trained athlete and rest. It's very important to know the difference between and rest and if they're exercising and rest. A pre-trained athlete's heart rate is probably 75 beats per minute. Now this is normal since SA no beats at 60 to 100 beats per minute. A trained athlete at rest will have a much slower heart rate, possible of 40 to 45 beats per minute. Now in a normal instance where they're both pre-trained, this will not be healthy. Something's wrong with the heart. But in this instance, it's because they have a higher parasympathetic activity. So we'll put that, and that is very important to note because they always focus on parasympathetic versus sympathetic activity. We'll talk about sympathetic later. But parasympathetic activity is released from the brain. It controls how hard the heart works. Parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest nervous system, so it always wants to conserve as much energy as possible. So in this instance, a trained athlete's heart is much stronger, so it wants to conserve the energy and release more acetylcholine to slow down the heart rate because it doesn't need to beat as fast as the pre-trained athlete. Now they need 75 beats per minute to maintain their cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. So remember, they both have the same cardiac output, around 5 or 6 liters per minute. Now, since their stroke volume is lower because the heart is much weaker, say 110 milliliters, their stroke volume is much lower because the heart is weaker, so their heart rate has to be higher to maintain that 5 liters per minute. Now for a trained athlete, their stroke volume is much higher because, again, I'm just playing with numbers here, but their stroke volume is much higher because the heart is so much stronger, it can pump more blood out with every single beat. Now since their stroke volume is so high, their heart rate doesn't have to be as great, so the body recognizes this and slows down the heart rate to conserve energy via the parasympathetic activity. So a trained athlete has more parasympathetic activity. Very important to know that word. Trained athlete, more parasympathetic. But their cardiac output is the same exact thing at 5 liters per minute. Now what this means is everyone has the same cardiac output. Women have slightly lower because they have slightly smaller hearts, smaller muscles, but in no way is that saying a woman cannot outrun a man or be stronger, have a stronger heart than a man. And then when they start exercising, pre-trained athletes, of course, their heart rate raises, their cardiac output will raise, their stroke volume will raise, and of course the same thing happens with a trained athlete, but their heart rate increases much slower. So at the same intensity of a pre-trained athlete and a trained athlete, so say this guy's running a 6-minute mile. Just picking numbers, but just say he's running a 6-minute mile. His heart rate will be fucking through the roof if he's never ran before. Now take the trained athlete, and he's also running a 6-minute mile. Same exact intensity, but his heart rate will be much lower because he is he's used to running 6-minute miles, so it's much slower at the same intensity. But vice versa, their stroke volume will be much higher at 6 minutes per mile it'll be like 170. So it'll be much higher at 6 minutes per mile. Whereas this guy, his cardiac output will be increased, but not that great at the same intensity because his heart's just not as strong as a trained athlete. And then do some simple math. Their cardiac output will be greater, around 20 liters per minute, but this dude's cardiac output will be through the roof and 30 liters per minute. So thus he can exercise much longer. So much greater cardiac output and a much greater stroke volume at the same intensity. Well, same intensity of stroke volume, but cardiac output will be much greater. Now the very last thing that will hit very, very fast is max heart rate. In case I don't know if they cover, but max heart rate is derived from a simple formula. The most basic formula is 220 minus your age. Now this isn't too accurate, but based on the population, this is mostly correct on the general population of like 1 billion people. So 220 minus your age. Now this is a predetermined number, so that means that obviously the older you grow, so if you're 20, your max heart rate will be much higher, around 200 beats per minute. Whereas if you're 30, your max heart rate will be lower at 190 beats per minute. So what this means is no matter how in shape you are, if you're an unfit athlete versus a very, very fit athlete, Usain Bolt, whatever, Hitchmal Gouge, a very trained athlete, your max heart rate, the hardest your heart can ever beat before you pass out, whatever, will always be lower than in a younger individual's. And of course, that doesn't mean you're slower than a younger individual. There's other factors such as stroke volume and cardiac output. But your max heart rate will always be lower than a younger individual because of 220 minus your age. So what this is saying is no amount of training will increase your max heart rate. It'll increase your stroke volume, yes. It'll increase your cardiac output, yes. But it will not increase your max heart rate. You're set with a max heart rate. It decreases with age. There's no way to fix that. Your heart, unfortunately, does get weaker with age. It gets older. But, of course, you can fix that with training. So that's basic training effects on the heart. So obviously you want to exercise to increase the strength of your heart.